before I forget. So I will try to record these sessions. And there is a link. So there, I provided a link to a playlist I created on my YouTube channel specifically for this class. And that link is under the first section on the top of our Moodle page. So you can just click that and it'll take you to the playlist where I'm uploading all of these videos. And I'll do that maybe sometimes the same day of the class, but it could be a day or two after if I forget. Okay. So let me share the screen and jump back into the slides that I was working through last time. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, so just to return to the very moment where we had to break at the conclusion of class. Let me check the chat here. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure, Nancy, are you gone at this point? Hold on. Sorry, I got a private chat from a student who might need to be let back in. Okay, my apologies. All right. Okay, so this is more or less where we broke at the close of class on Thursday. We were talking about how although there is an official indictment that Socrates is facing, he, before getting into his specific response to the substance of these charges, he mentions to the jurors, of which there would be roughly 300, right, that he had been accused in prior years of similar but sufficiently different charges. So I mentioned how strange this is. That is, if we understand someone who is occupying the role of a defendant, like Socrates is here, how strange it would be to proliferate, as it were, to generate more and more charges or accusations beyond the ones with which one is specifically dealing at the moment. Yet that's what Socrates does. And this is because of the power of rhetoric, rhetorical discourse, this sort of free-floating gossip that had gripped the Athenian consciousness from various sources at this point in time, such that given the finite space and period in which Socrates was given to defend himself, it would have been impossible. That is to say, entering the courtroom as a stranger, and he mentions that several times at the beginning of the piece, that is strange to the kind of discourse or speech which is appropriate for this context or venue. And that is, he has in mind specifically rhetorical discourse. As a philosopher, he engages rather in dialectic. And unlike rhetoric, which always has to, while revealing certain things in communication, conceal or distort other relevant facts, such to more efficaciously achieve the proper end goal of all rhetorical efforts, which is conviction or persuasion, independently of the truth. Now, that persuasion or conviction might very much concretely, given a specific scenario, be aligned with the truth. But the point is that rhetorical discourse doesn't have to concern itself with the truth. And it's for this reason that lawyers who are engaged in rhetoric, politicians who are engaged in rhetoric, marketers or advertisers who are engaged in rhetoric are not actually teaching those whom they're addressing, those with whom they are discoursing or communicating. You don't go to a political speech for truth, that is, to be edified in terms of facts, which are all pointing towards a truth, which is perhaps deeper than this or that individual fact. So for this reason, Socrates mentions that there are these other accusations. And he also comments at some point in the text that he's convinced, once he has been in fact convicted, he's convinced that he was not convicted by the real substance of the indictment that Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon had brought to the court. He thought that he had sufficiently defended himself against those charges, yet he was convicted. So what could that possibly mean? That he was instead convicted before he even uttered a word, before he even stepped foot into the courtroom of these previous charges, which, because they're ancient in origin and come from no particular voice, no determinate person of origin, it's impossible to address them directly, to refute or repudiate them. And so that's the power of rhetoric, right? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Is this where we get the kind of English literature or this analysis of rhetoric where we kind of get the English literature ideas of rhetorical fallacy?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Aristotle, Plato's finest student, who, for his part, as we'll see later on when we read Aristotle and the Gun, a really fantastic short science fiction story, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. But Aristotle is the one who systematically codified the very technical art of what we call rhetoric now in a text called On the Art of Rhetoric, or On Rhetoricae Techne in the Greek. So techne is the word for art, or it's a kind of productive knowledge. So for example, a doctor has a medical techne, is in possession of that sort of practical knowledge. A painter or a sculptor, well, they're in possession of the techne of the sculptural or plastic arts, or the pictorial arts. Someone who makes a house is in possession of the house building techne, and so forth. It's a kind of knowledge. And so it was really Aristotle who was influenced by Plato in dialogues like the Apology, but especially the dialogue Gorgias, which we had worked through on Thursday just a little bit, where the very term art of rhetoric, or rhetoricae techne in the Greek, was first articulated, was first expressed in the history of this intellectual tradition. So it's really Aristotle who lays out those three necessary components of rhetorical discourse. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, like pathos, right? And what are the other ones for those who have heard of this?
Logos and ethos.
Yeah. So pathos is your emotional response. And that's, to a large extent, what Socrates is criticizing here, that rhetoricians, orators, politicians, lawyers, advertisers, they can recognize or perceive some emotional condition, which for your own part, whether we're talking about desires, fears, anxieties, hopes, dreams, or whatever, might be obscure. You might not even recognize that you have a particular desire or fear. But advertisers and other such individuals who trade on this rhetorical power will be in a position to recognize this in you and exploit it, take advantage of it, but largely in an obscure or invisible way. And that's why rhetoricians have to carefully navigate this dynamic of revealing and concealing, because they don't want to reveal that kind of tapping into or exploitation of your hidden affective or emotional psychological reserve. And then ethos, I mean, logos, we've already been talking about that. Logos is reason, just to put it very simply. And then ethos is reputation, right? So you could be managing your rhetorical display quite competently in terms of tapping into the audience's emotional status, using rational argumentation, so deploying logos well, but you might have a terrible reputation. So you might be well known as a liar or something like that, in which case, even if you seem to present a sound argument, it might be difficult for the target audience to take you seriously, right? So those are elements of rhetoric that Aristotle presented and systematically um, contrived and laid out for us in, in many ways, and to a large extent, because of the criticism that Plato had made through the voice of Socrates in dialogues like this. So there's something of an ethical nature, right? If you don't think, when it comes to rhetorical persuasion, that how you come, that is, how you arrive at a particular conclusion, is relevant, well, then you don't think that it's necessary for one to arrive at a particular conclusion for good reason. So if I arrive at a particular conclusion because someone has manipulated me, um, and alternatively, if I arrive at a particular conclusion because of good reason, and I could communicate those reasons to you in my own argument, if you're of the mind that rhetoric is value, that is, morally speaking, neutral, then it doesn't really matter how I come to this conclusion, whether I have good reasons or whether I've been exploited or manipulated by other actors for their own intentions or motivations. But Socrates is saying there has to be a significant difference, right? So it would be more ethically praiseworthy for an individual to arrive at a particular truth as a conclusion on the basis of legitimate reason rather than simply being shaped by outside forces to that end. So does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, let me know if so feel free to, in a continuous way, to just jump in like Shane did here if you have a question, but hopefully, or if you'd like to make a comment, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So, let's see. There's this important distinction we were talking about. Wisdom as is attainable by man or the human, and this is Socratic wisdom. This is human wisdom, the kind of knowledge or wisdom which Socrates claims to legitimately possess. And the sophists, or the pre-Socratic, let's say, natural philosophers, are those who might be in possession of superhuman wisdom. That is to say, a kind of divine wisdom. Now, he respects this sort of wisdom insofar as it's possible, but the implication seems to be that he doesn't think it is, at least for his own part. And if Socrates is understood to be anything as a major figure in the history of philosophy, it's a student of human nature, right? So Socrates claims to have a peculiar sort of knowledge, and the reason he labels it human knowledge is because it's knowledge of what it means to be human. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So fleshing out the nature of these second accusations, which, by the way, are the ones that Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon are actually bringing to the court, is such that, and this is why Socrates at the beginning says, I'm only going to speak the truth. I'm not going to speak rhetorically, which again is why he's a stranger in the courtroom. And the truth is that Socrates has never been interested in the questions of natural philosophy. So, and also in terms of these second accusations, he doesn't corrupt the youth in terms of teaching them any particular, let's say, ideology or any particular system of thought or any doctrine of knowledge with a particular content. All he does is, as a midwife, ask questions. So famously, Socrates, in several Platonic dialogues, refers to himself as a midwife. And what does that mean? So what is an actual midwife? So what do midwives do?
They help deliver babies.
Yeah, they help deliver babies. In this case, as a philosophical midwife, Socrates is here to help deliver ideas with which individuals might be pregnant, to help bring to birth, to help bring to fruition certain ideas about the nature of reality, about how one understands one's own role and existence within the scope of that reality, to what extent one can know things, and so forth. So Socrates wants, through a series of questions and engaging with another person, an interlocutor, to bring to bear, to bring to light what is previously concealed, what is accessible by the individual only haphazardly, only in obscurity or confusion, to bring these nascent, dark, or implicit ideas from out of concealment into the light of day. Hence, midwifery in the Socratic sense is an eminently dialectical enterprise. Dialectic in the sense of bringing what was hidden or dark into illumination, into clarity. And that is for the individual herself or himself, such that Socrates is then only an occasion for the arising of truth. That is, for the event of truth to take place at the location, that is, at the place of this or that thinking individual. But as he also mentions in the context of recognizing himself as a kind of midwife, most of the time, the babies are stillborn. They aren't viable. They don't make it. And as an example, and this is why the early Platonic dialogues are referred to as Socratic, because Socrates and his real historical views are presented at the foreground, but they're also referred to as aporetic. So that's Aporetic, and it derives from the Greek word aporia, Aporia, which refers to a kind of closed passageway. So the A in that word, is like it is in aletheia, the word for truth. In English, it would be like non or un or d. And then paria is like a window or a door. So aporia means like a closed door. So as an example of this, so I mentioned that the Apology is one dialogue in a kind of thematic narrative, which is connected then to other dialogues. So I described the final dialogue in the series last time, the Phaedo, in which we find Socrates in prison drinking the hemlock and coming to his end. But the first in this series is a dialogue called the Euthyphro, and that's where we see Socrates approaching the court in Athens to first learn of the indictment, to first hear of the charges being brought against him. And in the process, he runs into the character Euthyphro, who is also about to go to the court, not to face any particular accusations of his own, but rather to make them. And he's going to make a charge, surprisingly, shockingly to Socrates, against his own father. So Euthyphro's on his way to accuse his own father of murder. And it's because we learn that Euthyphro's father is a landowner and one of the slaves, because there were slaves in Hellenic society, but it wasn't a racial institution like we're familiar with, sadly. Not sadly that it wasn't racial, but that we have this kind of dark history. But he, the father found that one of the slaves or workers had gotten drunk and killed someone. And so he tied the slave up and left him in an irrigation ditch in order to go seek out guidance from the authorities to see what he should do with him. But in the meantime, the guy died. So Euthyphro is charging his own father with murder, and Socrates takes this to be really distressing and surprising. And Euthyphro is understood to be a kind of prophet. That's how he presents himself. So he's deeply familiar, according to his own word, with the nature of holiness and piety. And Socrates says, wow, most people would say it's incredibly impious to do something like this to your own parent, to your own father, to charge them with such a high crime. Yet you claim to be an expert in piety. So please teach me what it means to be pious. And then here's Socratic irony for you. Socrates jokes, because I hear that I'm about to be charged with impiety myself. So if I learn what the nature of piety and holiness is from you, then I can go to my accusers. I can go to the court and say, hey, I learned everything I know about piety from Euthyphro, so if you have a problem, you should take it up with him. And Euthyphro is so arrogant, he doesn't get the joke, and he says, oh, yeah, you can do that, Socrates. But then, through a series of questions, it turns out Euthyphro can't answer um, the ultimate question in this context, which is, what is piety? What does it mean for one to be pious? What does it mean to participate in holy actions, pious actions? Euthyphro attempts to give a number of answers, but none of them are worthwhile. Hence, we get a series of stillborn babies. It turns out Euthyphro doesn't really know what piety is. Yet at the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro basically says, well, I gotta go. See you later, Socrates. And Socrates says, wait, but I wanted to learn everything from you so that I might live a great, noble, and pious life. Wait. And then Euthyphro goes into the court. But importantly, he goes into the court still under the impression that he has exhaustive, complete, authoritative knowledge about the nature of piety. And because of that belief that he knows what piety is, he's about to go indict his own father for murder under circumstances which are anything but obvious, right? So there's an incredible danger, an incredible risk that Euthyphro is about to thrust himself into, in many ways, thoughtlessly, right? He still doesn't know that he doesn't know what impiety is. Yet, as we've seen, Socrates does, and that's the nature of human wisdom. Okay. And so this is another, hopefully that makes sense. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So this is another important part of the dialogue where Socrates refers to himself as a kind of gadfly. So he says, I am a sort of gadfly given to the state by God. That is the god Apollo. And the state is like a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. So what is a gadfly? Does anyone know what that is?
Is it like, it sounds like a mosquito or like a really annoying bug?
Yeah, it's like a horsefly, right? And so that makes sense given that in the analogy, he is using a horse, right? So in this metaphor or in this analogy, we've got a horsefly and a horse. What are the analogs? So what is Socrates comparing in each case to the horsefly on the one hand and the horse on the other?
He himself is the horsefly, and then the horse would be all the other people.
Yeah, the horse would be Athens itself, the state as a whole, right?
Mhm.
Let's call it the political community of Athens. So in the confrontation set up in this analogy, we get a glimpse of Socratic radical political philosophy or political theory, much more radical than Plato's or even Aristotle's or even Plato's. Aristotle develops a much more, in many respects, conservative political system or theory. And we were kind of talking about the radical component of Socrates' approach to politics and political discourse last time, when we recognized this kind of inheritance to contemporary um, social justice movements, civil rights movements, that if you want to really affect meaningful and lasting political change in the direction of the just and the good, you have to do so in the capacity as a private citizen and not in political office, not in public office. So we get a dramatic dichotomy or wedge set up here between the private and the public. And that's because to survive even as a political actor, given particular persuasions of what is good and just, you have to compromise, right? Otherwise, you'll be killed. And that almost befell Socrates several times in his past, and he recounted those stories in the dialogue. But so we have then a confrontation between the philosopher and the demands of reason, the demands of thought, and the kind of freedom that would be understood to be necessary for that activity, and the state, the demands of political security, continuity, institutional consistency, and structuration, and so forth. So there's a confrontation here. But let's think about this a little bit to tease out some depth. So think about this metaphor. The horsefly is antagonistic in some way to the horse. But what is the scope of that antagonism? Does the horsefly want to kill the horse?
I don't think it wants to kill the horse, and I don't think it can. Maybe that's also how Socrates is seeing himself, because he can't do anything significant to this group of people. But also, I highlighted something that said it would be a mistake to kill him in the apology, because they're going to be lost without him. So maybe he sees himself as this annoying thing to them that in truth can't make a change, but without him, they're just going to be lost.
Good, perfect. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Great. That not only is the desire absent on the part of the horsefly to kill the horse, it's not even possible, right? And so that's an important feature of this analogy to keep in mind. Um, so the horsefly doesn't want to kill the horse, yet clearly the horsefly is bothering the horse, is an irritant to the horse. Now, the horse, for its part, would it want to kill the fly? Yeah, if it could. And sometimes it's successful. The horse certainly wants to kill the fly to eliminate this irritant. Um, Yet, think about, and this is anachronistic because we're dealing with pre-Darwinian philosophy and science here, obviously, but think about the relationship from an evolutionary standpoint, evolutionary biology in particular, when it comes to how the fly and the horse relate. So what means is given to the horse to combat or to react against the fly? What does a horse do when it's being bothered by a horsefly or any other insect?
Flicks it?
Yeah, so it can flick it with what? What body parts does it have for that?
Well, its ears, its tail, mostly, in my
Yeah, its ears, or
horse knowledge.
its long kind of flowing tail, or its mane, for example. So you can see horses kind of whipping their head around. Um, so the mane and the tail, just as two examples, those are arguably a pair of the most iconic features by which we recognize a horse as a horse. So if you were to make an illustration, a drawing of a horse, and you left out the tail or the mane, there would be something seriously missing. Yet, evolutionarily, we might say that the horse developed these parts only out of commerce, that is, interaction with the fly, right? So the horse then, from this point of view, can't even be what it is. It can't be the sort of being that it is without the antagonistic relationship that it bears to the fly. So then, using this analogy to set up the kind of relationship that we perceive between the philosopher and the state, that is, the political community, there is an antagonism. There is a kind of adversarial relating, but that is, say, a tension, but it is a necessary tension. It's a productive confrontation or antagonism. And And Renee was just making that point, I think, that without philosophical questioning, without the pause, the kind of space that dialectical inquiry both relies upon and affects or opens up, you might have the leaders of a political community, the state, as arrogant and convinced as they are of their own goodness, righteousness, and so forth. They might be bringing that whole community headlong to a cliff. Right? So think back to the Euthyphro dialogue, where this guy claims to know everything there is about the nature of piety, yet it turns out he doesn't know. And he's on his way on the basis of this concealed ignorance, this ignorance that's not forthcoming or available to him, to make a charge which will result in the death of his own father, right? So think of a politician who self-righteously understands what's good, what's right for the entire community, for the state, yet they don't have sufficient philosophical reflection to question their convictions. They might just be bringing that state towards ruin, right? Towards collapse. And on the other side, the philosopher, the horsefly, needs the state, right? Because, and this is why in the subsequent dialogue, the Crito, where Socrates is speaking to his friends and they're trying to convince him to flee, to escape, and to go into a kind of self-imposed exile, he refuses. And this is because Socrates, through his entire life, was convinced of the good of the political community. The city, the polis, that's where we get political. Polis means like city or city-state, the polis of Athens, that philosophy is not really possible outside of that context or milieu, because it's precisely dialogical. That is, it requires others. And others, when they get together, they build progressively, and if we're oriented by justice, ultimately towards the good in terms of that progress, a political system or community. And so the philosopher both benefits from the security of that community. Philosophical practice wouldn't be possible without it. And it's also necessary to ensure the strength, consistency, survivability, and righteousness of that political community. Right? And so this is what he means when he says that the unexamined life is not worth living for human beings. Right? Okay. So any questions about this? So those questions, what is the good? That is, so everyone desires the good. No one would deny it. If I ask you, it's like if you're having the seemingly endless discussion with your significant other of what to eat for dinner or something. What should we have for dinner? They might say, oh, I want something good. As if you would ever actively choose to eat something bad, right? Or terrible. Everyone wants the good. Everyone desires it, yet the confusion arises as to what that good is, what the substance, what the content or reality of it is. And this is where philosophical questioning is necessary. So we all desire the good, but what is the good? If we're religious, we want to be pious. We want to be in alignment with the holy, but precisely what is the pious or the holy? If we're artists or lovers of beauty, we want to be motivated by the desire for the beautiful, but precisely what is beauty? What is the beautiful? Well, that requires philosophical questioning and reflection. Yet for the most part, we take for granted a relatively facile or superficial understanding of these things that we've simply inherited from our family or from the basic social context in which we find ourselves develop. Okay, and so Socrates takes that to be essentially human. And so in that way, we can now look at this continuum of knowledge. So when the Apology and other early or perhaps middle Platonic texts are taught, especially in introductory philosophy courses, I think there's this misguided effort to present Socrates and Plato as these absolute champions of the dialectic, such that if you engage in philosophy, you can finally, through the iterative practice or act of uncovering what is confused or hidden, you can come to some final capital T truth, where you have now been delivered from all obscurity, from all bias, from all prejudice, and so forth. That is, you have delivered yourself from the corrosive grip of rhetoric. I want to suggest, however, against this, I would say, superficial reading, that what Socrates is suggesting is that there's no such thing, for human beings at least, of perfect knowledge, capital T truth, where all questions are answered, all problems are clarified. But at the same time, there's no such thing as perfect ignorance. Right? So there's a major problem that Socrates addresses in another early Platonic dialogue, the Meno, where we get the so-called Meno's paradox. And the paradox is this: learning, it seems, developing new knowledge is impossible. Why? Well, let's say you already are in possession of what you want to know. You already have it. Well, in that case, there's no pursuit. There's no learning necessary because you already know what you want to know. But let's say you don't know what you want to know. Well, if you don't know, that is, if you're not in possession of what you want to know, how can you ever recognize it when you find it? So you won't be in a position to actually realize when you have acquired the very truth you are seeking if you didn't previously have that truth. But if you previously had the truth, you wouldn't need to go seeking it because you would already have it. For this reason, it seems knowledge is impossible. Learning is impossible. Socrates responds to this paradox. He's not the one who proposes it. He responds to this paradox dismissively. He refers to it, in fact, as the debater's paradox. He says it's fallacious because, and this is where he presents this famous theory of knowledge as recollection, or from the Greek, anamnesis. Knowledge is really remembrance. So it's not learning anything new, it's simply recovering that which you previously had but lost. And for Socrates, this can happen absolutely, that is, to a degree of perfection, only once your soul has been released from the prison of the body. So the problem is, upon the moment of our incarnation, that is our physical embodiment of this body in this material universe, when that happens, when the soul has been put into a particular body, we lost all access to the perfect knowledge we previously enjoyed. And so all of our physical lives are made up of the effort to recover, to restore that which had been lost or taken away. And so when you learn something like a new math formula, an algebra or something, and you learn it and this kind of aha moment occurs. And at that point, you can't even really imagine what it was like to not know the thing that you now know. It's as if you did know it before, it was lost, and now it's been restored to you, right? And so we can use that to understand what's going on in this continuum, according to Socrates. Think of the very moment of your birth, the very moment of your being brought into the world. Even then, you're not in a state of perfect ignorance. You're always already in some relationship, say with your mother, right? From the very moment you're born, you cry out in desire. So there is some sort of liminal or implicit knowledge or understanding at play. So the very moment you exist, there is some hidden background which contains those biases, those prejudices, those fears, those hopes, those desires. And then from that moment of your birth, you are attempting to recover knowledge, and you question yourself through dialectic, So through philosophical reflection and interrogation, and you get closer in this iterative or progressive approximation towards truth, that is, towards perfect knowledge, but you can never get there, right? And so that's simply what human life is like. And in another dialogue, the Symposium, Socrates compares this to love. So think about your ideal relationship. If you hope to one day get married or something and stay with the other forever, let's say you're married and then 40 years from now, you're sitting at the Golden Corral or Applebee's or something over your gelatinous mac and cheese with your significant other across from you, and you're really just hoping that they don't say anything because you've already heard everything they have to talk about. There's nothing new. They're just so incredibly boring. Um, well, this is a pathological kind of relationship in terms of love that nobody would deliberately desire or ask for, because we think when we're in love with someone, there's always something more to uncover. There's always something more to be revealed, to know, to understand. The other is perceived then as an inexhaustible source of surprise, right? And this is how Socrates, as a lover of wisdom, remember that's really what philosophy means. This is how Socrates, as a lover of wisdom, explains the pursuit of knowledge. That if you actually have knowledge, the truth of the capital T, in a final sense, you can no longer be a philosopher because you don't desire what you already have, right? Um, okay. And so we're going to wrap this up now, but and then we'll take a break and we'll get into the reading for this week. But recall Socrates' rejection that he's engaged in natural philosophy, so teaching things about the heavens and what goes on below the earth, what physicists or geologists might do now. He denies that. And he claims that that's superhuman wisdom. And so use this little sphere here to pull apart and use this in connection with the continuum that I presented on the previous slide. So imagine that this sphere is the cosmos. So cosmos comes from the Greek. It means literally the ordered all, the ordered whole, the everything. And so we mean by that now universe, right? So imagine this sphere is the cosmos. It contains everything. So each of these little dots would be a fact that you can uncover through experience or thinking. So to have perfect knowledge, to reach the top of that continuum, you would have to possess the sort of knowledge that the Greeks characterized as cosmotheoros, which is built out of the word cosmos and also theoros, and that's the word from which we get theory, theoretical, and so forth. Theoros is like the act of being a spectator, right? So think about if you're at a sport event or something. Whatever you do, if you're watching it on television at home, for example, isn't going to affect the game, right? So as a spectator, you can't do anything to change those actions. And also what goes on in the game isn't really going to affect you very much, unless of course you're a gambler and you have a bunch of money staked on it. So theoretical knowledge then is a disinterested or separated, so a view from distance of the whole. So if you were to have such a view of the everything, you would have to be outside of it, right? You would have to be up here looking at it, over here, down here, over here, everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Yet, as a human being, you are necessarily always already thrown somewhere into that hole. So you're, one of these points, right? You're here or here or here or here, which means you have a very limited, finite vantage point from which to perceive and relate yourself to the whole, to the totality of being. So for this reason, you can never get to the cosmotheoretical point of superhuman wisdom. And this is why Socrates thinks that all we can hope for is human wisdom, recognition of our own finitude, of the limitations of what's possible for us to know. So does this make sense? So the very moment you realize that you have some prejudice or bias and you illuminate that through philosophical reflection, you haven't achieved the end, capital T truth, because in that effort, you have ignored something else, right? You've covered something else, and now there's a new obscure background that's at work in your engagement with the world and others. So every few years, KFC comes out with some new abomination, and this one's, a few years old at this point, but it's called the chizza, which is a pizza whose crust is constituted out of fried chicken, right? And so this is an example of advertising. So advertisers use, for instance, um, rhetorical argumentation, usually in a visual way, like this example, to persuade you of something. In this case, that the chizza is a good idea, right? To make you want to eat it. But there's never going to be small print, for example, that says, oh, if you eat this, you're going to get gout or hypertension or something like that, because that wouldn't be in the best interest of the advertiser in terms of the very product they're pushing. And they have to conceal certain things at the same time that they reveal what from a certain point of view appears to be attractive or appealing, to make you desire it. And so for that reason, your hidden desires, of which you might be embarrassed, for example, if you wouldn't tell anyone that you ate a chizza one day, the advertiser wants to lock into this. And it's for this reason that it's $1 billion industry. So if it were true that we're all these rational agents who can, through good reason, good argument, arrive at the best decisions and proper actions, well, then companies wouldn't invest so much in their advertising campaigns. So it's understood on the part of marketing that this is precisely the human condition. This is precisely how we are. And so here are just some basic conclusions, some upshots to take from this. So rhetoricians like lawyers, politicians, and advertisers share the same aim, which is to convince others, typically in an at least somewhat heterogeneous multitude. So you're going to have different people from different backgrounds in a space, to convince people of something, whether or not it's true. And they do so by navigating a dynamic economy of revealing some things and concealing others, which is determined by that background that you have, which is always obscured, your biases, your prejudices, fears, aspirations, anxieties, and so forth. Whereas the aim of dialectic as a philosophical instrument is to bring these implicit elements out of the background to make them, that is, explicit. And rhetoric functions only when it's kept hidden as rhetoric. But, and this is the point I was just making, and this is demonstrated by Socrates' behavior in court and the outcome, it's impossible to diffuse or to illuminate every one of these hidden background points or assumptions, given that there's always going to be such a background at play. So we cannot be cosmotheoros. We cannot possess and wield superhuman wisdom. This is why Socrates says that if he's convicted prior to that moment in the text, it won't be because of Meletus, Anytus, or Lycon, who actually brought the indictment, but because of the rhetorical conviction that had already been achieved before he even stepped foot into the court. So what is human wisdom? Well, it's knowing that you don't know. Knowing, in other words, that the path to wisdom, for mortal humans at least, doesn't end at any final possession of truth or knowledge. And this means that truth is not a possession to be won or lost, but one, it's an urgency that inspires us towards us. This is why even very young children who haven't been taught the concept of truth desire it. So even if you don't know what truth is or what a lie is as a concept, a child desires reality. They desire the truth. They don't want their parents to bullshit them, right? Um, and then truth is also a norm that allows us to know when our efforts to express it, when we have arrived at it, are adequate or inadequate. Okay. And so this is important because some of you might think, okay, well, so Socrates' wisdom is knowing that he doesn't know anything. Well, I don't fucking know anything either. Great. Are you going to write books about me? Right? Is that really the highest wisdom? You just say, well, I don't know shit. Now you're some sort of hero. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. So, in a world, and I think this has resonance with our current society, right? In a world where everyone seems to think they know things, right? That they have final, determinate, conclusive knowledge about things. In such a world where everyone seems to think they're an expert of one sort or another, it's pretty goddamn impressive for someone like Socrates to say, I don't know, right? So this sort of wisdom, although at the surface level might appear to be the easiest thing in the world, it's actually quite praiseworthy and difficult. It's difficult to achieve, to really recognize concretely, not just paying lip service to it, but to really recognize that your view of the world could be inadequate and to use that as a goad to ask further questions to gain more and more adequacy is difficult, right? It's something hard. It's not something straightforward that we can expect reliably. Okay. And so this is the last thing before we take a break. So many of you are psychology students. So who has heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? So this is fairly recent psychological research. It first arose in the 90s, I think the late 90s, 1999, and then there's some subsequent research. But it's basically emblematic of the human condition as understood thousands of years ago by Socrates. Right? So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which, to put it very simply, the dumbest among us are least disposed to recognize their dumbness. So people of low ability, and the lower that ability is or understanding is, have an illusory, misguided sense of superiority or expertise, right? So you begin then in ignorance and you suddenly ascend to Mount Stupid, where you realize or come to think that you know everything. And then it's through the Socratic recognition that you don't really know that you traverse the valley of despair here. So you uncover some fact, and that's sufficient to show that there is a virtual infinity of more facts to be uncovered. And then that's when you start to ascend more modestly on the slope of enlightenment. Okay. And so that's the trouble of the human condition. Those who least know think that they know the most. Right. Okay. So are there any comments or questions about that? About anything we just went over? Does it make sense? So that'll be really important. We spent a lot of time on it, but it'll be important in terms of our future conversations throughout this course, working with subsequent materials. So if any questions come up, feel free to ask. But let's take a quick break. So it's 11:40 now. If we can meet back here at 11:45, we'll jump into the John Perry dialogue. All right, so I'll see you guys in just a few minutes. All right, so it took a little longer than I wanted it to work through the rest of that dialogue. But Perry's dialogue, I think, is comparatively straightforward. So before we get into it, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about your experience doing this reading. So some impressions that might have occurred to you. Does anybody want to share? Yeah, Renee.
Is this the one that oh, sorry. Go ahead, Renee.
No, you can go. It's all good.
Okay, this is the one that occurred over 3 nights, right?
Yeah.
That's okay. I read the first and part of the second night yesterday, and I thought Miller's points over the first night were actually pretty convincing to me. From what I remember, I think he kind of explained that your soul, which is your pretty much how you describe yourself, I forgot what the exact word was, is based off of past memories. And I think that's true. If I were to face who I am or judge who I am, I think it's based off of lessons I've learned in the past.
Good. Yeah. So it's really the second night that the so-called memory view of self or personal identity gets presented. So you thought that one was kind of persuasive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Makes sense. Good. So that's a very famous approach to this question that we'll be working through today and to some extent Thursday, and we'll return to it periodically as we address the other theories. But this is a theory that originated from the 17th century from the philosopher John Locke. And some of you might have heard that name before, but he's more famous, I think, now in a lasting or a familiar way because of his contribution to social and political philosophy. So Locke is a member of the so-called social contract tradition, from which we actually derived our own operative system of government. But Locke is less famously, at least in terms of popular consciousness. Locke is also someone who has participated in metaphysics and epistemology. And these are some terms that we might spend a little bit of time clarifying, and we'll do so with some other terms that come up in this reading. But what is, and we talked about this briefly, so you might not remember, but on the very first day of class, we talked about some of the branches that make up the practice and discipline of philosophy. But what is metaphysics? Does anyone have an idea about that? Yeah, Renee, go ahead.
Didn't you say metaphysics is more like not like physical questions, but like getting into more spiritual and like after death sort of stuff?
Well, it can, but it's in the philosophical sense, metaphysics is much broader than you find, say, in the metaphysical section of a Barnes and Noble, where you'll see like books on fairies and like crystals and things of that nature. But historically, metaphysics arose out of philosophy in the ancient philosophical world as the investigation into the nature of reality, the basic fundamental nature of being or reality. And so this is why Descartes, as we'll see next week, he calls his book that we'll be spending time with, the Meditations on First Philosophy. So you could read that as the Meditations on Metaphysics. And so first philosophy, that means that we're dealing with the absolutely foundational here. And metaphysics as the fundamental question of the nature of reality, it's often associated and connected in its practice with epistemology, which is another branch of philosophy. Does anyone know what epistemology is? So we're doing both metaphysics and epistemology for this first unit of the course, where we're asking questions about selfhood, personal identity. So metaphysics, in the sense that we're asking what the self is, that's a metaphysical question. Just like we could pose a really broad metaphysical question about the nature of reality when we ask things like, is all of reality necessarily physical and material? So that would be a metaphysical view known as physicalism or materialism. Or we could say, no, there is physical stuff, of course, that makes up the universe, but there's also some non-physical or spiritual dimension. And so Descartes, who Miller references early on in the first night, that's a person that we'll be reading next week, who gives expression to the so-called soul view of personal identity. So in terms of Descartes' metaphysics, he is a dualist, which means that reality is both physical and non-physical. So there are two kinds of reality. Now, what is epistemology then? So if metaphysics is about the nature of what is, the nature of reality, what is epistemology?
Isn't it the nature of knowledge?
Yeah, so that's a simple way to put it. It's investigation into the fundamental nature of knowledge. So you could distill metaphysics down to one essential question, and that would be, what is real? You could do similarly for epistemology, distilling it down to the question, what is true? Right? So we might make a particular claim about the nature of selfhood or identity, such that, as Miller is arguing, the character Miller during the first night, that selfhood or personal identity is not your body, which of course, as we all know, can and will perish eventually, but your soul, which is supposed to be immortal and immaterial, unaffected by events in the material sphere. And so that's a metaphysical claim, that the self is the soul. But where does an epistemological question come in response to that? So in other words, to use the examples from the text, what does Weyrob say, the fictional philosophy professor, Gretchen Weyrob, whom we find in her hospital bed, slowly but determinately succumbing to the injuries she sustained in a motorcycle accident. Her friends are there to try to uplift her spirit or to assuage her fears or whatever. So Miller proposes the soul idea, that Weyrob isn't really her body, which is falling away, but her soul, which isn't threatened by such an eventuality. So that's a metaphysical position. But what is Weyrob's response to that? What does she say about that? What's the problem with the soul view? Maybe someone who hasn't spoken up yet. Anybody want to jump in? I might just call on someone. How about Patrick? Patrick Whitker, what do you think? Are you there? Patrick? I'll try one more cold call, Renee, and then, and then I'll come back to you. How about Elena? I haven't heard from you today.
If I'm being honest, I'm still kind of like figuring it out. So I'm still kind of listening. I don't really have an opinion or anything to say yet.
Okay, but do you remember when, because it's pretty early on in the reading, when Miller said, unlike a Kleenex box, for example, this is the famous Kleenex box moment from the text, which once it's incinerated, pounded, and flushed down the toilet, it won't exist anymore. The same can't be said about Weyrob, because she's not just a physical thing like a Kleenex box is, but she actually has a soul. But what's the problem with this idea? Yeah, Renee, do you want to jump in now?
Doesn't it essentially boil down to that even if your soul, the soul isn't, when it's not inhabiting anything, it's not really like a living thing, that you can do whatever you want to the person's body, but once that's gone, the soul, like, it can't interact with anything. It's not like a physical thing that can still live in this world.
Yeah, so does Weyrob deny the existence of souls? Is that a part of her response and her argument? Or what does she really say?
I'm trying to find it again because I read this at like 3 in the morning when I was doing other stuff as well. So I'm trying to continue where the thought was at 3 in the morning.
It's at the bottom of page 2.
Could I add something?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I remember she said something about like her soul and her own consciousness, like maybe existing, but like her own memories weren't there, and she herself wouldn't be like feeling all the pleasures and displeasures that maybe her soul was feeling.
Yeah, so that's good. We have to, maybe it'll be helpful to back up a little bit. So just a big picture. What's going on in this dialogue? So we have three people speaking together under dire circumstances. So one of the main characters is about to die. We're led to understand this is an eventuality. And her friends want to convince her that it's not final. And so what does she demand? This is a really important point at the beginning of this dialogue. What does Weyrob want Miller and Cohen to be able to do for her? So what is she asking for?
Isn't she asking for like hope that somehow she'll live on after death?
And so what word does she use in terms of what would allow hope to take shape?
Comfort?
No, she wants to know if it is, what's the adjective I'm looking for?
Possible.
Possible, right? So she's trying to determine the possibility of life after bodily death. And she distinguishes this from probability, right? So this is a subtle but significant philosophical distinction. So she wants to know whether it's possible, given the facts, given that she is injured, given what the doctors and medical expertise are projecting, and even beyond that, what we know about what it means to exist as a human organism, that at one point, regardless of how it happens, we're going to die. Our bodies will cease to exist. So she wants to know, given those kinds of facts, how it's possible that she can survive death. And so possible, not probable, means conceivable, right? So when she says, how is it possible? She wants to know how she can conceive of this as a futural event. That is to say, in 1,000 years, as Miller suggests, she'll be in a place where Miller will be in a place, and they can communicate, they can discourse with each other, despite the fact that their bodies had perished millennia before, right? So she simply wants to know whether or how it is conceivable to even imagine this. And what are, and you guys were just getting at this, especially Charles, I think. So what are the two necessary components that would answer this conceivability? So for her to be able to conceive that despite the fact that in a few days' time her body will be dead, she, Gretchen Weyrob in particular, will be alive in say 100 years or 1,000 years. So what are those two conditions? So this is in the text where she forestalls, as she puts it, Miller's exercise in comparative religion, where he's saying, oh, well, you could merge with the flow of being, or giving some kind of rough ecological response. So of course, we know that when we die, our bodies, insofar as we understand that energy cannot be destroyed, it just gets redistributed, that will go on, will continue in some fashion. But that's not what she wants to know. That's not what we mean when we use these religious scenarios or images to characterize survival of some measure beyond our own bodily death. So what would we need in order to be convinced, again, not that it's probable, not that this is something we can even expect reasonably, but that we can at least think of it, we can at least imagine it, it can make some sense to us. What are the two conditions required? And this will help us illuminate in some way the essential nature of identity, the essential nature of what it means to be consistently anything at all.
Doesn't she say in the text that she would want to remember her experiences on Earth and remember who she is as a person?
Yeah, so now from the point of view of Gretchen Weyrob 1,000 years in the future, she would want to be able to remember, that is backwards looking, to recollect her experiences on Earth. So that's one of the conditions. And what's the next one? So that's looking from the point of view of who Gretchen Weyrob would be in 1,000 years looking back. But now what's the necessary condition for Gretchen Weyrob now in the present, prior to her death, looking to the future?
Isn't it that she's continuing to, that in the afterlife she would continue to learn and grow and continue to have life and make new memories, but also still while remembering who she was? So essentially having eternal life, but also keeping the memories that she had and growing as a person more.
Yeah, so being able to make new memories. In other words, if you expect that in the future there will be new experiences that you undergo of which there will be retained memories, then that means from this position you are anticipating a future life. So then the two conditions are memory and anticipation. And so it's from memory and anticipation that we get personal identity. Let's see. And so that first comes up on page 2. And she says, so this person will be related to me in such a way that it is correct for me to be, or excuse me, correct for me to anticipate, to look forward to those future experiences. And I am related to her in such a way that it will be right for her to remember what I have thought and done, to feel remorse for what I have done wrong, and pride in what I have done right. And the only relation that supports anticipation and memory in this way is simply identity. Right? So it's at this point in the text that the first question, having to do with the possibility of surviving beyond bodily death, opens up to the question of what it means to be anything at all, of what it means to have an identity. And so another important distinction before we move on, but is that clear? Are there any questions about that? So personal identity then is what's in question when we're reflecting upon whether or not we can endure the event of our own bodily demise. And that means anticipation and memory, forward looking, backward looking. Here we are in the present as a self between those directions, between those poles. And so now the question is, well, what exactly is that self? What exactly is that personal identity between those two poles? And having now distinguished between probability and possibility, she makes a distinction between, and this language isn't used explicitly, but we might say numerical identity versus qualitative identity. And so that comes up first on page 3 in response to the Kleenex box analogy. So here's how that happens, right? She says, how is it possible? Tell me. And he says, oh, well, it's totally possible. You just think, well, I die now, and then in 1,000 years, here I am again. And so she brings up the Kleenex box. She says, that would be like me telling you that the Kleenex box that is on this shelf in your living room, I have taken it, set it on fire, mashed up the ashes, and sent them down the toilet. Yet, when you come home, that very same Kleenex box will be on the shelf. That's a contradiction. It's impossible to even conceive. So Miller says, well, you could imagine a Kleenex box has simply been replaced, right? So one Kleenex box looks exactly like the other Kleenex box. So maybe I have annihilated the previous box, but then I've replaced it with one that's exactly similar. So maybe that's what happens. And she says, well, that's not identity. So here we're gaining clarity as to what identity means in specific contrast with something like exact similarity. And so this is something we'll turn to later on in a couple weeks, in particular when we come to Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, 9 Lives. But the argument that Weyrob presents here is such that to be a self, that is to have an identity, requires singularity. And this is what is meant by numerical identity. And this is why, and some of you might have this experience, and I think, I can't remember who it was, but one of you might remind me, has an identical twin, right? Is anybody here with a twin? I think someone shared that detail in your introduction. But if you have an identical twin, the adjective identical isn't very strict in that kind of context. You are maybe from the point of view of an outside observer, exactly similar to your twin, but you do not share identity, strictly speaking, because you're still dealing with two selves, two consciousnesses, two different orders of experience. So you're very similar to your twin, and there is an undeniable bond, an intimacy in terms of your very existence, you might say. And that becomes a curious question for us, as we'll see. But that's qualitative identity. So that means just like if you have one Kleenex box here and another here, they look the same, they share all features in common, which means they have qualitative identity. But they're still different in the sense that they have different numerical identities. And you know that because you can count them. You can say there are two Kleenex boxes here. Or if you perceive two identical twins, you can say there are two persons standing before me rather than one, right? So that's really crucial to get clarity on. There's a difference to be observed between exact similarity and strict identity. So when we get to Hume in week 4, so David Hume will give a version of the no self view. Hume will argue there's no such thing as the self. He'll refer to what I called here qualitative identity. So the identity by which two things share similar qualities. He'll call that specific identity. And that's because as the species human, I am identical to you. You are identical to me and to everyone else. So that's why Hume uses specific identity. But numerically, we're not identical. We're all different, right? So Weyrob is looking for an answer when it comes to the nature of personal identity. She's looking for an answer that will satisfy the conditions of strict, proper identity. That is to say, numerical identity, not obvious points of congruity or sameness that can be found across different individuals. So does that make sense? Okay. So in response to the Kleenex box analogy, so now we're making our way back to the soul view that we're trying to understand and perhaps criticize. So Miller says, oh, you're right. I was speaking foolishly. You, Gretchen Weyrob, are not the same as the Kleenex box, because unlike the Kleenex box, you are not purely physical. You, in addition to being a body, are a soul. And so the Kleenex box is entirely annihilated, but you, there will be a remainder. That is, there will be the soul left over. And so that's what you are. You are a soul. And so the soul view is associated explicitly by Miller with Rene Descartes. Right? And so it's Descartes that we'll be reading next week to gain depth in our engagement with and our addressing this idea of selfhood as being a soul. But how is the soul defined? So how does Miller define the soul? Does anyone remember?
Is that the time when he says that, like, your soul can see and smell, but you can't see and smell your? It's.
Yeah.
I think it said something like that. I think I commented on that part, and I agreed with him on that part.
Right. So how we define the soul, and there are different ways from various, say, theological or philosophical traditions to do this. And in fact, Miller says that we might make fine-tuned distinctions between soul, self, mind, consciousness, but for present purposes, he's making those synonymous or interchangeable. And Descartes, as we'll see next week, will do the same thing, right? So he's really giving voice to the Cartesian view here, that every human individual is simultaneously body and soul. And while the body dies, the soul is not constrained by such physical necessities. So the soul will go on. Yet at this point, we've come to a discussion of personal identity. So how it is that we're able to identify individuals as those individuals across different times, different temporal moments. So then, as a simple example, how is it that now on this Tuesday, I am able to perceive you, Renee, or you, Robbie, as the same individuals that I saw as these two-dimensional little faces on my computer screen last week? How am I able to do that? How am I able to say, oh, here's Robbie, and Robbie was in this class last week. I recognize this face before me as Robbie's face. How do I do that? If the principle of identity is the soul, well then I'm not making that recognition because of what I am visually seeing before me, given that the soul is nothing we can see. It's nothing we can smell. So if the soul is the principle of identity, it would remain completely mysterious how human beings are able to make simple identity recognitions or claims in our ordinary everyday experience. Does that make sense? So this is where the box of chocolates analogy comes in. So she asks Miller, if you've had a box of chocolates, like how do you know that one particular chocolate is, say, caramel rather than being cream filled or something like that? And he says, well, there's a corresponding mark on the top of the chocolate that he recognizes and says, oh yeah, that means that there's caramel inside. Yet, on the basis of what kind of experience is that recognition possible? So how is Miller able to do that with chocolates? How is he able to take a chocolate that has a particular shape or design and say, that one has caramel in it?
Recognizing what it looks like based on previous experience.
Yeah, so previously he saw a chocolate that looked similar and he bit into it and found there was caramel. And he did that enough over time that he can now see this chocolate that he has not yet bit into and anticipate that it'll be caramel when he does so. This is supposed to be analogous to recognizing a person after having known them previously. So I would reason then, same soul, same body. Yet, what is the crucial difference between recognizing a person as the same versus recognizing a chocolate as the same?
Is there only like one answer to that? Because I think I can answer it, but I don't know if I'm going to be right.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the chocolate, like, it's not gonna change. Like, they're always gonna make it the same. Or as a person, it can change over time, and like you don't know what to expect from them.
Yeah, that's good. And that's actually a really nice way, I think, to explain the problem um, with identifying a soul or recognizing it as the same across context because of perceived psychological characteristics. And that's a proposal that Miller floats towards the end of the first night, right? So I see you behaving in a way that I find typical for you. So I find your behavior expressive of who you are based on what I've encountered before. But how can I be so sure that I really know who you are? You might surprise me. We might even surprise ourselves, right? We might do things in certain situations that we think, wow, I can't believe I did that. And it could be for good or for bad, right? So certain moments or events that we encounter or undergo, we come to find we don't really know who we are. And the same could be for others, for example. So just because someone is behaving strangely, you don't immediately conclude, oh my God, this must be an entirely new person. This is an imposter. Someone has inhabited Nancy's body, right? You just think, oh, Nancy's behaving a little peculiar or something. So that's good. But there's an easier problem. So that's a little more complicated, what you just shared there as an answer. There's an easier way to respond to the difficulty. Unlike a chocolate, which I've experienced both in terms of its outside appearance and the flavor of its inside content, both are available to me in my experience. So I can bite into it at one point, say, okay, this design means this interior. And then I can use that principle for future experiences with chocolate. But when it comes to you guys, I can't like break open um, Renee or Danny or anybody else and say, all right, there's the soul. And now I recognize that that soul will be there whenever I see this body. I can't experience your soul because, as Miller said, the soul is precisely that which is not observable. It's immaterial. And so let's see. So the soul cannot be observed, right? By definition, yet identity requires observation. So when I identify you all as the same persons you or I saw last time, I need to observe. So then if, and here's where we'll end, so we're out of time, and we'll pick this up where we left off last time. But if it's true that the soul is the principle of identity, then it would be entirely mysterious how I'm able to recognize you as the same, as identical across different times. Yet, she says, it's not mysterious. I'm doing it myself right now very easily. We do it all the time. Therefore, she concludes through a kind of logical argument that it cannot be the soul that operates as this principle of identity. Now, this is an epistemological criticism. So she's not saying with this argument that there are no souls, that souls don't exist. She's saying that even if souls do exist, it's not because of them that we're able to identify people as the same across different moments. Right? Does that make sense? So it's an epistemological problem with the soul. There are metaphysical problems with the soul too, but we haven't really gotten into those yet. And we'll spend most of the time next week dealing with those issues. But are there any final questions or comments before we go? We'll continue this conversation next time, and we'll start with John Locke's theory of memory as the basis of identity. And then we'll have our first group giving us a presentation. So again, if you haven't yet signed up for a group, please do so. And the idea is you just, as a group, take ownership over the class discussion for 10, 15 minutes or so. So you can point out things you find interesting, ask questions, engage the class, and so forth. So yeah, sign up for a group if you haven't already. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys on Thursday. See ya.
Hi, could I talk to you for a second?
Oh yeah, sure.
So all that we have to do really to get me enrolled in the class is I just have to forward an